Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, way back, to a period so brutal and unsanitized it makes your morning commute look like a spa retreat. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the biting cold seeping through thin, homespun fabric. Feel the grit of unpaved roads beneath worn leather boots. Hear the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the incessant bleating of sheep, and the less than pleasant aroma of, well, everything. You're not just watching a historical drama, you're in it. You're moving through narrow, winding alleys, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and something distinctly less appealing you can't quite place. This isn't the romanticized version of history you see in movies, full of dashing heroes and spotless castles. Oh no, this is the real deal. This is the Middle Ages. And let me tell you, you probably won't survive this. Specifically, we're going to peel back the layers of what it was truly like to navigate this incredibly challenging world, focusing on one of its most enigmatic figures, the medieval assassin. Forget everything you think you know from video games and action flicks. This wasn't about parkour over rooftops and silent, swift kills with a hidden blade. The reality was far more mundane, far more painful, and significantly less glamorous. You weren't a sleek, shadowy operative with a cool hoodie. You were likely just another person trying to survive in a world where survival itself was an achievement. The idea of a clandestine brotherhood, a sophisticated network of master killers, is mostly a product of later Romanticism, particularly the lore around the Nizari Ismailis, often conflated with the term Hashashin. Historians still argue whether the legendary Order of Assassins was a cohesive, centralized organization or simply a convenient label applied to various political and religious extremists of the time. Your initiation into this grim reality, should you choose to accept such a perilous path, would be less about mystical rituals and more about sheer desperation. Perhaps you were an orphan, abandoned to the unforgiving streets, or a peasant driven by famine to seek any means of survival. Maybe you were coerced, indebted, or simply stumbled into the orbit of someone powerful enough to demand your life for their agenda. You wouldn't be trained in exotic martial arts. Instead, you'd learn to wield a basic knife, perhaps a simple sword, and more importantly, the art of blending in. To be unseen was your greatest weapon, and in a world where most people stayed within a few miles of their birth village, anyone new stood out like a sore thumb. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening, drop a comment below and let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far these sleepy history lessons travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you mentally step into the rough tunic and scratchy wool hose of a medieval operative, you realize that your primary concern isn't achieving a complex political objective, but rather simply not dying before you even begin. A mainstream historical fact is that the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages lived short, brutal lives, often succumbing to disease, famine, or violence long before reaching old age. A quirky tidbit: one popular medieval disguise for someone trying to move unnoticed was simply to dress as a common pilgrim. As they were expected to be traveling and often carried simple provisions, they were, in a way, the original anonymous travelers. You wouldn't be slipping through expertly guarded compounds. You'd be navigating muddy paths, avoiding suspicious villagers, and praying you didn't catch the latest plague. As you stumble through this medieval landscape, the first thing that truly hits you, besides the occasional whiff of something unspeakable, is the sheer brevity of life. You're not just an assassin, you're a human being in a time when the average lifespan was, frankly, terrifyingly short. We're talking about an average of around 30 to 35 years, if you were lucky, and that's an average. Skewed by those who survived infancy, a mainstream historical fact is that infant mortality rates were incredibly high, with a significant portion of children not making it past their 5th birthday. If you beat those odds, you still faced a relentless gauntlet of challenges. You weren't worried about retirement plans or a midlife crisis. You were worried about making it to next Tuesday. So, as you walk down that muddy track, every cough you hear, Every shiver you feel carries a much heavier weight. A simple cut from a thorn bush could turn into a raging infection, and without antibiotics, that infection could easily claim your life within days. Imagine stepping on something sharp in the muck, a broken piece of pottery, a splintered bone, and knowing that such a minor mishap could be the end of your short journey. There were no urgent care clinics, no sterile bandages, just folk remedies and a prayer. This constant dance with mortality profoundly shaped medieval society, and by extension, your psyche as someone trying to stay alive and fulfill a dangerous mission. People lived in the moment, to a degree, because the future was so uncertain. This wasn't necessarily a carefree existence, but one where every harvest, every successful birth, every day without a major catastrophe, felt like a small victory. It lent a certain fatalism to their outlook. If you were a medieval operative, your training wouldn't include escape routes and backup plans. It would include the understanding that failure almost certainly meant a swift, unpleasant end. Your employers wouldn't be paying for your long-term benefits package. A quirky tidbit about this era of short lifespans: some historians believe the medieval obsession with relics and saints grew partly out of this deep-seated fear of death and disease. People desperately sought tangible connections to the divine, hoping for miraculous cures or intercessions to prolong their precarious existences. Imagine clasping a small, worn amulet, believing it holds the power to ward off the very illness that's currently ravaging your village. That's not just faith, it's a plea for more time. Historians still argue whether this pervasive threat of early death led to a more intense embrace of religious piety or, conversely, a more hedonistic approach to life for those who could afford it, trying to squeeze every drop of pleasure from their limited years. But for you, the aspiring assassin, or even just the average commoner, neither extreme felt like an option. You were likely too busy trying to find your next meal or avoid the latest outbreak of dysentery to ponder existential dilemmas. Your potential targets, the wealthy and powerful, might have had access to slightly better food and shelter, but they were by no means immune. Kings and queens still succumbed to common illnesses. Even they knew that their grip on life was tenuous. This played into the dynamics of power and loyalty. A lord needed healthy, able-bodied peasants, and a peasant needed a lord who could offer some semblance of protection. It was a symbiotic, if often exploitative, relationship forged in the crucible of short lifespans and constant peril. You, the person tasked with eliminating such a figure, knew that their mortality, just like yours, was an ever-present, vulnerable point, with the ever-present shadow of an early demise hanging over you. The daily ritual of eating, which we often take for granted, becomes an exercise in grim necessity. You're not picking from a menu. My friend, you're grateful for whatever sustenance you can get your hands on, and more often than not, it's going to be bland gruel and stale bread. This isn't the artisanal sourdough you might enjoy today. This is hard, often mouldy, and made from whatever grains were cheapest and most available, usually rye or barley. You'd chew it slowly, not for enjoyment, but to soften it enough to swallow. Imagine waking up to the same dull, watery porridge every single day. No spices, no sugar, rarely even salt if you were truly poor, just boiled grain. Perhaps thinned with water, or if you were exceptionally fortunate, some watered-down milk. Your primary concern isn't flavor, it's caloric intake. You need energy for the grueling physical labor that defines most medieval lives. Whether you're a peasant in the fields or, dare I say, an operative needing to move swiftly and silently, you don't get the luxury of being picky. If it's edible and provides energy, it's going into your mouth. A mainstream historical fact is that meat was a luxury, mostly reserved for the wealthy or for special feast days. For the common person, animal protein came from eggs, dairy, if you had access to livestock, or occasionally small game caught illegally. Vegetables were often seasonal and limited, and the concept of a balanced diet was utterly unknown. Your body would constantly crave nutrients it wasn't getting, leading to chronic fatigue, weak bones, and a susceptibility to every passing illness. Picture yourself, an aspiring assassin, trying to maintain peak physical condition on a diet that would make a modern nutritionist weep. It's truly a wonder anyone had the energy to do anything, let alone plot a clandestine mission. This dietary monotony also affected social life. There were no elaborate dining experiences for the average person. Meals were quick, functional affairs, often eaten by hand. Forks, for instance, were a relatively late introduction and initially viewed with suspicion. A quirky tidbit is that peasant bread was often so hard, it doubled as a plate, known as a trencher. After the meal, the trencher, now soaked with whatever meagre juices were left from the stew, might be given to the dogs, or if you were truly hungry, eaten. Talk about getting your money's worth out of your tableware. Historians still argue whether the widespread consumption of weak ale or cider, even by children, was primarily due to its caloric value, its relative safety compared to often contaminated water, or simply a cultural preference. Regardless, for you, it was often the most reliable way to stay hydrated without risking immediate illness. You'd drink it not for pleasure, but because it was marginally better than the questionable water source nearby. The lack of varied and nutritious food would leave you in a constant state of mild malnutrition. Your teeth would ache from the coarse grains, your stomach would rumble, and your energy would ebb and flow unpredictably. This isn't the stuff of heroic legends, is it? No pre-mission power shakes, no strategic calorie loading, just a gnawing hunger, a reliance on whatever you could forage or be given, and the knowledge that a bad harvest could mean starvation for you and everyone you knew. It reminds you of the old saying, an army marches on its stomach. Well, a medieval assassin probably hobbled on one, too, having suffered through a monotonous meal. You then have to navigate the very environment you live in. And believe me, medieval cities were far from picturesque. Forget charming cobblestones and quaint shops. Imagine instead streets overflowing with refuse and raw sewage. This isn't just a minor inconvenience, it's a fundamental, pervasive aspect of daily life that would assault your senses and constantly threaten your health. Every step you take is a careful negotiation around puddles of indeterminate origin, piles of discarded waste, and the ever-present risk of slipping on something truly disgusting. A mainstream historical fact is that formal waste disposal systems were virtually non-existent in most medieval towns and cities. People simply threw their household waste, food scraps, animal entrails, chamber pot contents out their windows directly into the street. The concept of public hygiene as we understand it simply wasn't a thing. Rain might wash some of it away into open ditches, but mostly, it just accumulated. You'd walk through streets that were essentially open sewers, a constant breeding ground for disease. The air would be thick with the stench, a multi-layered aroma of human and animal waste, rotting food, smoke from hearths, and unwashed bodies. You'd quickly become accustomed to holding your breath or simply accepting the pervasive odor as the natural smell of existence. For you, the would-be operative, this presented both challenges and, well, let's call them opportunities. On one hand, moving silently and discreetly through such an environment was difficult. Every splash, every squelch, could give you away. The darkness of night offered some cover, but also increased the risk of stepping into something truly vile. Or worse, unseen dangers like open pits or aggressive stray animals. On the other hand, the sheer chaos and filth provided a kind of camouflage in a world where everyone was covered in a layer of grime. A bit of extra dirt wouldn't make you stand out. A quirky tidbit, in some towns there were actual laws, albeit rarely enforced, about when you could empty your chamber pot into the street, usually with a shouted warning like "Gardez-le." Imagine walking down the street and having to dodge a cascade of human waste. It makes you rethink modern city living, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether the widespread use of strong perfumes and aromatic herbs by the wealthy was primarily for aesthetic pleasure or a desperate attempt to mask the truly appalling smells of daily life. For the common person, though, such luxuries were unimaginable. Your clothes, your skin, your very hair would absorb the omnipresent stink, making it an inescapable part of your identity. You couldn't just freshen up with a quick shower. The idea of clean, running water for personal hygiene was a distant dream. So, as you pick your way through the muck, trying to stay unnoticed, you realize that your mission, whatever it may be, is just one challenge among many before you can even consider your target. You have to survive the journey through an environment that is actively trying to make you sick. The modern romantic notion of a cloaked figure gliding through silent, misty streets quickly dissolves into the much grittier reality of wading through ankle-deep filth. Trying not to gag, it gives a whole new meaning to dirty work. Doesn't it, given the delightful state of medieval streets? It's probably no surprise that the concept of plumbing's non-existence would fundamentally shape your daily existence. Forget your modern bathroom, your flushing toilet, or even a simple faucet in the Middle Ages. These were concepts from a science fiction novel. You are now intimately familiar with the chamber pot, a humble vessel that served as your personal sanitation system, and as we discussed, its contents often ended up in the street, or perhaps in a cesspit if you were lucky enough to be in a more organized, albeit still primitive, urban dwelling. A mainstream historical fact is that most people in the Middle Ages simply relieved themselves wherever convenient, whether it was a designated garderobe, a fancy word for a latrine chute in a castle wall, often emptying directly into the moat, a communal privy, or just a quiet corner in the field or alleyway. There was no widespread understanding of germ theory, so the connection between waste, flies, and disease was simply not made. The idea of washing your hands after using the facilities would have seemed utterly bizarre. You'd be lucky to have access to water for drinking, let alone for personal hygiene. Imagine waking up in a drafty hovel, feeling the call of nature. Your only option is a pot, which then needs to be emptied. There's no privacy beyond what a thin curtain might offer, and certainly no ventilation system to whisk away the odours, and this is just inside your dwelling. Outside, the situation escalates. Public latrines, when they existed, were often little more than benches with holes over a shared trench, open to the elements and, more critically, open to the public gaze. It makes you realize just how much we take basic privacy and convenience for granted. For you, the operative, this lack of plumbing presented unique challenges. Stealth operations in a castle would be complicated by the very public nature of its facilities. Trying to sneak through a garderobe chute, for example, would be an incredibly unpleasant and potentially very noisy affair. A quirky tidbit: some medieval medical texts actually advised against holding in your bodily functions, believing it led to illness. So, in a way, they encouraged the constant public emptying of bladders and bowels, further contributing to the general unsanitary conditions. It was a vicious cycle of discomfort and disease. Historians still argue whether the high death tolls from plagues like the Black Death were primarily due to the lack of medical knowledge or the truly appalling sanitary conditions that allowed diseases to spread like wildfire. But for you, living it, the answer would seem obvious. Every breath you take in a medieval town is filled with microscopic particles of something you really don't want to inhale. Every drink of water carries the risk of contamination from upstream waste. The persistent lack of proper waste disposal also had an environmental impact, though not one the medieval mind would have recognized. Rivers and streams, often the primary sources of drinking water, would be heavily polluted with human and animal waste, contributing to widespread waterborne diseases. You wouldn't think twice about drinking from a river, even if you saw something suspicious floating by. What else would you do? This fundamental difference in sanitation infrastructure, or lack thereof, meant that life was not just harder, but fundamentally dirtier and more precarious than anything we can truly comprehend today. It's a miracle anyone survived to an old age, let alone successfully carried out a clandestine mission, with filth as your constant companion. The prospect of falling ill in the Middle Ages was not just a concern, it was a looming terror. You're talking about a time when medical horrors were the norm, and the cures for common ailments often made things far worse. Imagine having a toothache so excruciating you can barely think, and your only option is to visit a local barber surgeon whose toolkit consists of rusty pliers and a strong sense of optimism. This wasn't specialized medicine, this was often guesswork, tradition, and a whole lot of prayer. A mainstream historical fact is that bloodletting was a remarkably common medical practice, believed to balance the body's humours, an ancient theory that health depended on the correct balance of four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Feeling feverish? Let out some blood. Got a cough? Drain a bit more. The irony, of course, is that this often weakened already sick patients, making them even more susceptible to infection and prolonging their recovery. If they recovered at all, you'd lie there, watching as a barber surgeon made an incision or applied leeches, hoping against hope that this ancient ritual would somehow alleviate your suffering. Even as you felt weaker by the minute, it's like trying to fix a leaky bucket by poking more holes in it. Then there was trepanning, a truly horrifying procedure where a hole was drilled or scraped into the skull. This was done for various reasons, from headaches and epilepsy to mental illness, believed to release evil spirits or relieve pressure. Picture yourself conscious, perhaps restrained. As someone approaches your head with a drill or chisel, the pain would be unimaginable, and the chances of infection, given the lack of sterile instruments and practices, were almost 100%. If you survived the initial procedure, you'd then face a slow, agonizing death from brain infection. It makes a trip to the modern dentist feel like a luxury spa day. For you, the operative, getting injured or sick on a mission was a death sentence. A broken bone couldn't just be set and healed, it often led to lifelong disability or fatal infection. A simple fever could incapacitate you, leaving you vulnerable to discovery or unable to complete your task. A quirky tidbit is that urine was sometimes used in medieval medicine for diagnosis, with physicians inspecting its color, smell, and even taste. Yes, taste. Historians still argue whether medieval medical practices, despite their often brutal and ineffective nature, occasionally stumbled upon cures through sheer trial and error, or if patient recovery was more often due to the body's natural healing abilities overcoming the treatment. But for anyone actually enduring these practices, the distinction was irrelevant. You were at the mercy of practitioners who, while perhaps well-intentioned, operated with a profound lack of anatomical and physiological understanding. Your best bet for survival, outside of sheer luck, was simply to avoid getting sick or injured in the first place, which in that era was a full-time job in itself. It's enough to make you want to wrap yourself in bubble wrap and never leave your bed. Even if you somehow dodged the butcher's knife of the barber surgeon, there was another insidious enemy lurking in your very mouth. Dental decay nightmare. Imagine a constant, dull throb, sometimes sharp and excruciating, emanating from deep within your jaw. This isn't just a minor discomfort. It's a pervasive, debilitating pain that would utterly consume your thoughts. And unlike today, there were no easy fixes, no pain relievers beyond perhaps a swig of something alcoholic or a poultice of dubious herbs. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval diets, particularly for the poor, were coarse and abrasive, full of grit from millstones and tough, unprocessed grains. This, combined with a complete lack of oral hygiene, led to rampant tooth decay, abscesses, and gum disease. There were no toothbrushes, no toothpaste, and certainly no regular dental checkups. You'd chew on hard bread, and perhaps tiny fragments of stone from the milling process would constantly wear down your enamel. Imagine the constant irritation, the exposed nerves, and the ever-present threat of infection spreading from your mouth throughout your body. For you, the operative, a severe toothache wasn't just painful, it was a significant liability. How could you blend in, remain unnoticed, or perform a delicate task when every movement of your jaw sent shooting pains through your skull? How could you eat the meager rations available if chewing was agony? An untreated dental abscess could swell your face grotesquely, making you highly conspicuous, and eventually lead to a fatal infection spreading to your brain or bloodstream. A quirky tidbit is that some medieval cures for toothache involved rather bizarre rituals, like carrying a dead mouse in your pocket, or touching the tooth to the gravestone of a saint. Needless to say, these methods weren't particularly effective. One could argue they only added to the charm of the medieval experience. Historians still argue whether the relatively lower sugar consumption among common folk, compared to modern diets, actually led to fewer cavities. or if the sheer abrasiveness of the diet and lack of any cleaning negated any such benefit. What's clear is that if you had a bad tooth, your options were limited and brutal. Extraction, performed by the aforementioned barber surgeon, was a last resort. It was a crude affair, with no anesthetic beyond perhaps a strong drink. And the tools were designed more for brute force than precision. You'd be held down, and the tooth would be yanked out, often bringing a piece of your jawbone along for the ride. The aftermath would be an open wound in your mouth, prone to infection, and a gaping hole that would make eating even more difficult. So, as you try to sleep on your straw mattress, the phantom ache in your jaw, or perhaps a very real, throbbing pain, would be a constant, unwelcome companion. It's a subtle but relentless reminder that your body, just like your environment, is constantly trying to betray you. The romance of the medieval assassin quickly fades when you realize their greatest challenge might not have been a cunning enemy, but simply a rotten molar. If toothaches were a relentless personal torment, then the broader category of disease's deadly grip was the Grim Reaper's widespread embrace across the entire population. You are not just facing individual health struggles, you are living in a time when infectious diseases swept through communities with terrifying speed and lethality. A simple cough, a minor fever, or a persistent stomachache could rapidly escalate into a life-threatening condition. In this world, a common cold truly could be a death sentence. A mainstream historical fact is that plagues like the Black Death decimated populations, sometimes wiping out a third or even half of Europe's inhabitants in successive waves. But even in the absence of such catastrophic pandemics, everyday life was riddled with endemic diseases: dysentery, tuberculosis, smallpox, measles, influenza. Without modern understanding of hygiene, germ theory, or effective treatments, these illnesses moved unchecked. Imagine the fear every time someone in your village fell ill. You knew it wasn't just their problem, it was everyone's. Your survival depended as much on dumb luck and a robust immune system as it did on any skill or precaution you might take. For you, the operative, this meant that your most dangerous adversary might not be a guard or a target, but an invisible microbe. You could plan a perfect infiltration, execute a flawless mission, only to be struck down by a sudden fever days later, leaving you too weak to escape, or even to move from your bed. Travel was particularly perilous, as you'd inadvertently carry diseases from one community to another, or pick them up from the strangers you encountered on the road. A quirky tidbit: during outbreaks, some medieval doctors would wear bird-like masks with long beaks filled with aromatic herbs, believing this would filter out bad air or miasma, which they thought caused disease. While a striking image, it did precisely nothing to stop the spread of actual germs. Historians still argue whether medieval people were more resigned to death due to its constant presence, or if the sheer unpredictability and horror of widespread disease led to deep psychological trauma and social upheaval. For you, the answer would probably be a bit of both. You'd witness loved ones, neighbors, even entire families simply vanish, consumed by sickness. This constant exposure to death, the sight of bodies being carted away, the despair of seeing no effective remedy, would harden you. Yet, it would also instill a profound, almost primal, fear. Every time you heard a sneeze, or saw someone with a rash, a cold dread would settle in your stomach. There were no quarantines as we understand them, no vaccines, no antibiotics. Your only defense was isolation, if you could manage it, or simply hoping that your body could fight off whatever invisible attacker had found its way in. It was a constant game of chance, with incredibly high stakes. The modern world, with its relative freedom from such widespread, unchecked disease, is a luxury almost unfathomable to the medieval mind. It truly makes you appreciate the simple fact of breathing easy without wondering if the very air itself carries your demise. If disease didn't get you, the justice system, or what passed for it, might. And in the Middle Ages, justice was often a public spectacle, a grim form of entertainment known as public executions. You'd witness these events not as a detached observer, but as a part of the crowd, forced to confront the brutality of the law up close. This wasn't a quick, sanitized process hidden behind prison walls. It was a performance designed to instill fear and demonstrate power. A mainstream historical fact is that executions were often elaborate affairs, timed for market days or festivals, ensuring the largest possible audience. Common methods included hanging, beheading, and drawing and quartering, each designed for maximum impact and deterrent effect. Imagine the scene, a makeshift gallows erected in the town square, surrounded by a jostling, murmuring throng. The condemned, often bruised and broken, would be paraded through the streets, sometimes mocked, sometimes pelted with refuse. The executioner, a figure both feared and reviled, would be meticulously preparing his tools. The air would be thick with anticipation, dread, and the pervasive smells of the city. For you, the operative, witnessing such a display would be a chilling reminder of your own precarious existence. The line between criminal and commoner was thin, and accusations could be arbitrary. If caught, your fate would be swift and public. There would be no appeals, no fancy lawyers. Your mission, whatever it was, would feel incredibly high stakes in the face of such raw, unvarnished power. You'd see firsthand the consequences of breaking the law, or even just being accused of breaking it. A quirky tidbit, sometimes. The condemned would be allowed to make a final speech, often a confession or a plea for forgiveness. This was less about their last words and more about the spectacle, providing a dramatic climax to the public display. Imagine the hush that would fall over the crowd, only to be broken by the groan of the gallows or the thud of the axe. It sounds like something out of a horror film, doesn't it? But for them, it was just Tuesday. Historians still argue whether these public executions were truly effective deterrents to crime, or if they instead desensitized the populace to violence and merely served to reinforce the authority of the ruling class. For the people of the time, though, it was a terrifying demonstration of power. You'd walk away from such an event with the images seared into your mind, perhaps a lingering scent of blood or fear in the air. It's a stark contrast to our modern understanding of justice, which, for all its flaws, at least attempts to hide its most gruesome aspects from public view. In the medieval world, the message was clear: conform, or face the consequences in front of everyone you know. If the public executions were the grand finale of medieval justice, then the prelude was often a much more insidious and private affair, torture's cruel tools. When you're accused of a crime, especially a serious one, the goal isn't necessarily to prove your guilt through evidence, but to extract a confession, and for that, they had an array of methods designed to inflict pain, fear, and psychological torment. Often with chilling creativity, a mainstream historical fact is that torture was widely used as a means of interrogation, especially during the Inquisition or in cases of treason. The idea was that a confession, even if coerced, was the most direct path to truth and justice. Common tools and methods included the rack, designed to stretch a person's limbs to dislocating points, thumbscrews and leg vices, to crush digits or limbs, and various forms of water torture or sleep deprivation. Imagine being dragged into a damp, stone-walled chamber, dimly lit by flickering torches. The air is cold, heavy with the smell of fear and stale sweat. You see the instruments laid out, glinting dully in the low light. The interrogator's voice is calm, almost bored, as they explain what awaits you. For you, the potential operative, the threat of torture was ever present. If your mission failed, if you were captured, you knew what awaited you. There was no escape, no easy way out. The goal was not just to break your body, but your will, to force you to betray your allies, your mission, or simply confess to whatever they accused you of. And in this era, a confession, even under duress, was considered legally binding. A quirky tidbit is that some torturers were believed to have specialized in certain types of pain, becoming morbidly renowned for their particular techniques. It's a grim thought that someone could be an expert in human suffering, isn't it? Historians still argue whether torture was effective in eliciting truthful confessions, or if it simply led to false confessions from desperate individuals willing to say anything to stop the pain. Most modern scholars agree it was the latter, leading to many innocent people confessing to crimes they didn't commit. But in the medieval mind, the logic was often, if they are innocent, God will give them strength to resist the pain. The sheer lack of understanding of human psychology and the effects of extreme duress meant that such practices continued unchecked. So, as you go about your dangerous work, the thought of capture isn't just about imprisonment or execution, it's about the agonizing process leading up to it. It's about the deliberate, systematic breaking of a human spirit. It serves as a stark reminder that in the Middle Ages, the cruelty wasn't always accidental or a byproduct of ignorance. Sometimes it was meticulously designed and purposefully applied. It really puts the boring in history, doesn't it? Because who wants to be on the receiving end of that, stepping away from the immediate threat of torture and execution? Let's zoom out to the broader social structure that defined the lives of the vast majority of people, serfdom's harsh chains. You weren't a free agent in the medieval world, certainly not in the way we understand personal liberty today. If you were born into a peasant family, you were almost certainly born a serf, essentially tied to the land you worked and under the absolute authority of a lord. This wasn't chattel slavery, where you could be bought and sold like property, but it was a system that offered little more freedom. A mainstream historical fact is that serfs were legally bound to the land and could not leave without the lord's permission. If the land was sold, you came with it, along with your family and your meager possessions. Your life was dictated by the seasons and the demands of your feudal lord. You tilled his fields, paid taxes in kind, a portion of your harvest, and provided labor services for his estate, often before you could even tend to your own small plot. Imagine your entire existence revolving around the whims of one powerful individual, knowing that every ear of corn you grew, every egg your chicken laid, was subject to his claim. For you, the hypothetical operative rising from such a background, this would be a powerful motivator. Perhaps your dangerous mission is a desperate bid for freedom, a way to escape the endless cycle of obligation and poverty. Or perhaps you're acting on behalf of a lord. Compelled by your unbreakable oath, your understanding of freedom would be incredibly limited. Simply being able to choose where you slept or what you ate would be an unimaginable luxury for most serfs. A quirky tidbit is that serfs sometimes paid fees for specific rights, like merchet, for permission to marry someone from outside the manor, or heriot, a death tax where the lord claimed the best animal or chattel of a deceased serf. So, even in death, you couldn't escape the lord's grip. It was truly a system designed to extract everything possible from your labor. Historians still argue whether serfdom was a necessary system for economic stability in a pre-industrial agrarian society, or a fundamentally exploitative institution that stifled innovation and human potential from your perspective as a serf. However, it was simply reality. You were born into it, you would die in it, and your children would likely follow the same path. There was no social mobility in the modern sense. The boundaries of your world were your village, your lord's manor, and perhaps the nearest market town. Any dreams of adventure or autonomy would be quickly extinguished by the relentless demands of the land and the ever-present eye of the lord's reeve, his overseer. This meant that even if you were an assassin, your movements and activities would be severely constrained. Operating truly independently would be nearly impossible. You'd always be an outsider, or you'd have to convincingly pretend to be a visiting merchant or pilgrim, as we discussed. Trying to shake off the invisible chains of your birth, the weight of this lack of self-determination, the knowledge that your life was not your own, would be a constant burden, perhaps even more so than the physical hardships. It's a reminder that true freedom, not just survival, was the ultimate prize in this brutal age, bound by the harsh chains of serfdom. Your day-to-day existence was defined by the peasant's endless labor. This wasn't just a job, it was your entire life, stretching from the first light of dawn until the stars appeared in the ink-black sky, with barely a moment for rest or personal pursuits. You didn't go to work, you were work. A mainstream historical fact is that agricultural labor was incredibly demanding and physically brutal, involving manual plowing with primitive tools, sowing by hand, weeding vast fields, and harvesting crops with sickles or scythes. Imagine bending over for hours, your back aching, your hands calloused and cracked from the constant friction of wood and soil. There were no tractors, no advanced machinery, just human muscle and the strength of draft animals, if you were fortunate enough to have them. Every single loaf of bread, every piece of cloth, every drop of ale was the direct result of someone's relentless physical exertion. For you, the medieval operative or just a common serf, your body was your most important, and often only, tool. It was constantly pushed to its limits, day after day, year after year. The cycle of the seasons dictated your life. Spring was for ploughing and sowing, summer for weeding and haymaking, autumn for harvesting, and winter for repair, logging, and other maintenance, often in bitter cold. There was no weekend as we know it, though Sundays were typically reserved for church and some limited rest. Your reward for all this toil, a meagre living, just enough to survive until the next harvest, and the continued protection of your lord. This constant physical drain meant that any extracurricular activity, like training in secret combat or intelligence gathering, would be utterly exhausting. You'd be battling not just external threats, but the profound fatigue that settled deep into your bones. A quirky tidbit is that many medieval peasants literally ate dirt or clay in times of extreme famine, as a desperate attempt to fill their stomachs, which often led to illness. It's a stark reminder of the desperate lengths people would go to simply survive another day. Historians still argue whether the apparent lack of technological innovation in medieval agriculture was due to a stable, if brutal, social system that didn't incentivize change, or if it was simply a reflection of limited scientific understanding and available resources. For the peasant, though, it meant perpetual struggle. You wouldn't be thinking about improving the efficiency of your plough, you'd be thinking about whether your family would have enough to eat through the winter. The endless labour also limited your world. You rarely travelled beyond your village or the nearest market town, because every moment away from the fields was a moment of lost production, threatening your survival. This insular existence meant that news travelled slowly, and outsiders were viewed with suspicion. It made the concept of a hidden, mobile assassin even more far-fetched. You were part of the landscape, literally, and your life was a continuous, back-breaking testament to the sheer effort required to sustain human existence in an era without modern conveniences. It truly makes you appreciate the relative ease of simply pressing a button to turn on a light or stepping into a warm, comfortable home after a day's work. Beyond the endless cycle of labour, your very existence was shadowed by the constant fear of raids. This wasn't just a distant possibility you read about in a newspaper. It was a very real, very personal threat that could materialize from over the horizon at any moment, turning your world upside down in an instant. Your village, your home, your family, all were vulnerable to sudden, brutal violence. A mainstream historical fact is that local lords often engaged in petty feuds and skirmishes, leading to raids on neighbouring territories to steal resources, capture prisoners, or simply exert dominance. On a larger scale, incursions by Viking raiders, Magyar horsemen, or later, mercenary bands, meant that no part of Europe was truly safe from unexpected aggression. Imagine working in the fields, your back turned, when suddenly the distant sound of horns or shouts pierces the air. Panic would ripple through the community, and you'd instinctively gather your family, grabbing what little you could, and run for the safety of the local church or a fortified manor house, if one existed nearby. For you, whether a peasant or an operative trying to blend in, this constant threat meant a life lived with a heightened sense of vigilance. Every stranger on the road was a potential threat. Every unexplained fire on the horizon sent a chill down your spine. The notion of peace and quiet was a fleeting luxury. Your sense of security was entirely dependent on the strength of your local lord's defences, or simply on the hope that your village was too small or poor to be worth raiding. A quirky tidbit: some medieval villages had watchtowers or even bells in the church steeple that would be rung in a specific, urgent pattern to warn of approaching danger, serving as an early alarm system. Imagine the jolt of fear that would course through you hearing that frantic, clanging sound. Historians still argue whether the constant threat of localized violence and raiding contributed to the feudal system's enduring power. As peasants traded their labor and freedom for the Lord's promise of protection, it certainly seems like a compelling argument when your alternative is being captured, killed, or having your meager harvest burned. For you, this was the harsh bargain of life. You relied on your Lord's knights, imperfect as they might be, to stand between you and utter destruction. This environment of constant insecurity also shaped the very landscape. Villages were often clustered together, not just for social reasons, but for mutual defense. Homes might be built with thicker walls, or even have secret hiding places for valuables. Bridges might be easily destroyed, or roads intentionally made difficult to traverse, all to hinder invading forces. Even as an assassin, trying to move discreetly, you'd be acutely aware of this atmosphere of fear. Every shadow could conceal an enemy. Every unexpected sound could signal impending doom. It added another layer of grim complexity to an already difficult existence, reminding you that your life was constantly at the mercy of forces beyond your control, both human and microbial. Sweet dreams. Indeed, in a world where death lurked around every corner and logic often failed to provide answers, it's no wonder that superstition's stronghold was so absolute. You lived in a realm where the lines between the natural and the supernatural were blurred, and unseen forces were believed to influence every aspect of your life, from the success of your harvest to the onset of illness. A mainstream historical fact is that belief in witches, demons, and the power of folk remedies was deeply ingrained in medieval society, often coexisting, sometimes uneasily. With Christian doctrine, if your crops failed, it might not just be bad weather, it could be the work of a malevolent spirit. If a child fell ill, it might be an evil eye cast upon them. People wore amulets, performed rituals, and sought out local cunning folk or wise women for protection, spells, and cures that went beyond the rudimentary medical practices of the time. Imagine genuinely believing that a specific herb, gathered under a full moon, had the power to ward off fever, or that a particular prayer could protect your home from lightning. For you, the medieval individual, whether an assassin or a peasant, these beliefs were not quaint traditions, they were an integral part of your worldview. You'd avoid certain paths after dark, fear specific omens, and perhaps even carry a small charm for good luck. The fear of magic, both good and evil, was very real. If you were an operative, you might even try to exploit these superstitions, perhaps spreading rumors of a curse to make your target more vulnerable, or using a strange symbol to instill fear. A quirky tidbit: one common medieval superstition involved hanging effigies or specific animal parts, like a horse's skull, over barn doors to ward off evil spirits and protect livestock. So, your barn might have looked like a rather macabre art installation to the modern eye. Historians still argue whether the widespread belief in magic and the supernatural provided a sense of control and explanation in an unpredictable world, or if it instead fostered fear and prevented a more rational understanding of natural phenomena. For the medieval person, it was both. It offered comfort in its explanations, but also new layers of anxiety. You'd live in constant awareness of invisible forces, always careful not to offend a fairy, anger a ghost, or fall victim to a witch's curse. This pervasive superstition also influenced daily decisions. Certain days might be considered unlucky for travel or starting new ventures. Specific words or gestures might be avoided for fear of inviting misfortune. Even as you moved through your perilous world, you would always have one eye on the omens, trying to interpret the flight of birds or the shape of a cloud. It's a striking contrast to our modern, often cynical, view of the world, where science and reason attempt to explain everything. In the Middle Ages, the unexplained was simply attributed to forces beyond human comprehension, making life both more mystical and, often, more terrifying. Living under the heavy hand of superstition, another profound limitation of medieval life becomes starkly clear: illiteracy's dark ages. For the vast majority of people, the ability to read and write wasn't just a specialized skill, it was a luxury. A secret language accessible only to a tiny elite. You, as a common person, would navigate your world entirely without written communication, relying solely on spoken words and visual cues. A mainstream historical fact is that literacy rates in the Middle Ages were incredibly low, with perhaps only 5 to 10% of the population, primarily clergy and some members of the nobility or merchant class, being able to read and write to any significant degree. Imagine a world without books, without newspapers, without signs telling you where to go or what to buy. Information travelled by word of mouth, often distorted through rumour and anecdote. Your knowledge of the world beyond your immediate village would be entirely dependent on travellers, merchants, or the sermons of the local priest. For you, the operative or peasant, this lack of literacy meant a profound dependence on others. If you needed a message conveyed, you'd have to find someone to write it for you, and trust them implicitly. If you received a message, you'd need someone to read it aloud. This created immense power imbalances, with the literate holding significant sway over the illiterate masses. Imagine trying to forge documents or decipher coded messages when you couldn't even read your own name. It's truly a testament to how different their cognitive landscape was from ours. A quirky tidbit: to combat illiteracy, many medieval churches used stained glass windows and murals to tell biblical stories visually, effectively acting as picture books for the largely unlettered congregation. It was a clever way to convey complex narratives without needing words. Historians still argue whether the widespread illiteracy of the Middle Ages hindered technological and scientific advancement, or if the emphasis on oral tradition and craft skills simply fostered different kinds of knowledge transmission. What's clear is that for the average person, a written document, like a contract or a royal decree, held an almost mystical authority because its contents were impenetrable without a literate intermediary. You'd stand before a lord's decree, perhaps a tax increase, and have to trust his scribe's reading of it, with no way to verify its accuracy yourself. This profound illiteracy also meant that historical knowledge was primarily passed down through oral tradition, prone to embellishment and change over generations. There were no widespread standardized texts to refer to. Your understanding of your own history, your family's lineage, or even basic legal rights would be based on what you were told, not what you could read. This is a crucial difference from our information-saturated world. It makes you realize how much we take for granted the simple act of looking something up. In the Middle Ages, the truth was often in the ear of the beholder, and misinformation could spread like wildfire without any readily available means of fact-checking. Stepping away from the mental constraints of illiteracy, let's consider the physical constraints of medieval life, specifically the less than glamorous reality of fashion's uncomfortable side. Forget the flowing gowns and polished armor you see in movies. Your daily attire was a utilitarian nightmare of scratchy fabrics, restrictive layers, and styles designed for function over comfort, or even basic hygiene. A mainstream historical fact is that wool was the predominant fabric for most clothing, from tunics to hose, because it was durable, relatively easy to produce, and offered warmth. However, raw, unprocessed wool is incredibly itchy, especially when worn directly against the skin. Imagine wearing a full wool outfit, day in and day out, in varying temperatures. Without the benefit of regular washing, it would be constantly irritating, trapping sweat and grime against your skin. Underneath the wool, you might have a linen or hemp shift, which offered some protection, but these fabrics were also coarse and not nearly as soft as modern cotton. For you, the medieval person, your clothing wasn't about making a statement, it was about protection from the elements and practicality for labor. Layers were common, not just for warmth, but because clothes weren't washed frequently. You might wear the same set of garments for weeks or even months, adding more layers in winter and shedding some in summer, but rarely fully changing or washing everything. The concept of separate outfits for different occasions was mostly reserved for the very wealthy. Even if you were an operative needing to blend in, your options for disguise would be limited to different variations of peasant or commoner garb, a different coloured tunic, perhaps, or a simpler cloak. A quirky tidbit: Sumptuary laws existed in many medieval societies, dictating what certain social classes were allowed to wear, especially in terms of fabric, colour, or trim. This wasn't just about showing off, it was an attempt to maintain social order and prevent commoners from dressing above their station. So, you couldn't just throw on a silk tunic to look important, even if you could afford it. Historians still argue whether these restrictive clothing styles, particularly the tight lacing and layers, contributed to health issues like poor circulation or skin infections, or if people simply adapted to the discomfort as a normal part of life. What is undeniable is the constant feeling of being encased in coarse, unyielding fabric. Imagine trying to move quickly or perform delicate tasks while your clothing chafed, rubbed, and restricted your movements. There were no stretchy fabrics, no breathable synthetics. Every garment was a commitment. Footwear was equally basic, simple leather shoes or boots, often without separate left and right designations, offering little cushioning or arch support. Walking for miles on unpaved roads in such footwear would lead to blisters, aches, and tired feet. Even as an assassin, your elaborate stealth moves would be hampered by the constant discomfort of your ill-fitting, scratchy garments, the romantic image of a graceful, agile figure in the shadows gives way to the much more realistic picture of someone constantly itching, shifting, and perhaps smelling a bit. Lived in. Moving up the social ladder from the discomfort of peasant garb, you encounter figures who seem more heroic, more glamorous, the knights. But peel back the shining armour, and you'll discover that knights' less glamorous role involved far more than just chivalrous duels and rescuing damsels. Their reality was often brutal, dirty, and deeply entrenched in the harsh realities of medieval power. A mainstream historical fact is that knights were primarily hardened warriors and enforcers of their lord's will, often responsible for collecting taxes, suppressing peasant rebellions, and conducting raids on rival territories. Their training was rigorous and began in childhood, but it wasn't just about wielding a sword, it was about discipline, loyalty, and the willingness to inflict violence. Imagine a knight in full armour, not on a pristine tournament ground, but trudging through mud, his steel clanking, his breath misting in the cold air, heading towards a village to demand tribute or quash a local uprising. This wasn't about honour, it was about power, control, and the often ugly business of maintaining feudal order for you, the medieval operative or commoner. A knight was a figure of both awe and terror. They were the embodiment of power, capable of dispensing both justice and brutal punishment. If you were an assassin, approaching a knight, whether as a target or as someone to be avoided, would be a daunting prospect. Their armour, though clunky, was incredibly effective against most common weapons, and their combat skills were honed through years of practice and real-world violence. A quirky tidbit, the phrase knight in shining armour might be a bit of a misnomer. As armour was rarely shining for long, it rusted, got dented, and was covered in dirt and grime from campaigning. A truly shining set of armour likely meant it was new or polished for a ceremonial occasion, not combat. Historians still argue whether the concept of chivalry, which emerged later in the medieval period, was a genuine attempt to civilize warfare and knightly conduct, or simply a literary ideal rarely practiced in the brutal reality of the battlefield. What's clear is that the daily life of a knight often involved long periods of boredom interspersed with moments of extreme danger and violence. They were landowners, administrators, and sometimes even petty criminals, using their martial prowess to secure their position in a highly competitive and often brutal society. So, as you observe a group of passing knights, you see not just figures of legend, but hardened professionals. Their armour might gleam in the sun, but underneath, they were sweaty, perhaps stinking, and absolutely lethal. They weren't fighting for abstract ideals, they were fighting for land, for loyalty, and for their lord's power. It gives a whole new, much grittier, meaning to the medieval hero. You wouldn't be looking for a shining example of virtue, you'd be looking for a dangerous, well-armed individual who could end your life with a single, practiced blow. If a knight's daily life was often less than glamorous, then the ultimate expression of their profession, warfare's brutal reality, was an absolute nightmare. Forget grand strategies and honorable duels, medieval battles were chaotic, terrifying, and incredibly gruesome affairs where survival was largely a matter of luck amidst the carnage. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval battles were often fought hand-to-hand, in tight formations, leading to immense casualties from bladed weapons, blunt force trauma, and piercing projectiles. Imagine the scene, two armies clashing, not on a neatly organized field, but often in muddy, uneven terrain. The air would be filled with the screams of men, the clang of steel, the thud of arrows, and the terrifying roar of charging horses. You'd be pressed shoulder to shoulder with your comrades. Your vision obscured by dust and the crush of bodies. There was no clean kill, no quick end for most. It was a prolonged, desperate struggle where individual skill was often overwhelmed by sheer numbers and the brutal randomness of combat. For you, a participant, or even an observer from afar, the experience would be profoundly traumatic. The sight of dismembered bodies, the sound of men gurgling their last breaths, the smell of blood and fear, these would be etched into your memory. There were no medics on the field, no triage tents. If you went down, you were likely left for dead, or, if you were lucky, captured and held for ransom, as an operative perhaps caught in the crossfire, or observing a siege. As some, you'd quickly grasp that the battlefield was a place of utter madness, where planning often dissolved into primal survival. A quirky tidbit: medieval siege warfare often involved truly repulsive tactics, such as catapulting diseased animal carcasses or even human waste over castle walls to spread illness among the defenders. Talk about a biological weapon that wasn't exactly precise. It certainly makes you appreciate modern Geneva Conventions, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether the high casualty rates in medieval battles were primarily due to the lack of effective medical treatment for wounds, or the sheer destructive power of the weapons themselves, which were designed to crush and mutilate rather than deliver clean, quick kills. What's undeniable is the level of personal exposure to violence. You couldn't hide behind a trench or a fortified position for long. It was about facing your enemy directly, often knowing that one false move, one moment of hesitation, could be your last. The aftermath of a battle was often as horrifying as the fighting itself. The dead would be plundered, sometimes stripped naked. The wounded would lie agonizingly, perhaps for days, before succumbing to their injuries or being mercifully dispatched. The ground would be churned into a bloody mire. It's a far cry from the sanitized, cinematic portrayals of medieval combat. This wasn't a glorious adventure. It was a desperate, terrifying struggle for survival that left deep scars, both physical and psychological, on everyone who experienced it. It truly highlights the thin line between life and death in an era where violence was an intimate, ever-present threat. Escaping the horrors of the battlefield, you might dream of the relative safety and grandeur of a castle, but let me tell you, castle life's discomforts would quickly disabuse you of any romantic notions. These imposing fortresses, while symbols of power and protection, were far from luxurious. They were cold, damp, drafty, and often surprisingly unsanitary. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval castles were built primarily for defense, not comfort. Their massive stone walls, while formidable against attack, were terrible insulators. Imagine living in a building that effectively acts as a giant refrigerator. In winter, even with roaring fires in massive hearths, the warmth barely extended beyond the immediate vicinity of the flames. Smoke would often fill the great hall, stinging your eyes and coating everything in a fine layer of soot. Because chimneys were not always perfectly designed or efficient, you'd constantly shiver, your breath misting in the air indoors, and sleep huddled under thick furs and blankets, still feeling the chill seep into your bones. For you, the operative perhaps trying to infiltrate such a structure, or simply living within its walls as a servant, the dampness would be pervasive. Stone walls weep with moisture, especially in a humid climate. Mold and mildew would be common, contributing to respiratory ailments. Imagine the constant musty smell, mixed with the odor of unwashed bodies, cooking fires, and perhaps the refuse from the aforementioned guardrobes emptying into the moat below. A quirky tidbit: to combat the cold and damp, straw or rushes were often strewn across the castle floors, not just for insulation, but also to absorb spills and provide a softer surface. However, These rushes were rarely changed, becoming breeding grounds for fleas, lice, and various forms of filth. So, you might be walking on a literal carpet of ancient garbage. Delightful. Historians still argue whether the concept of a comfort, as we understand it, simply didn't exist for most people, or if medieval individuals simply had a much higher tolerance for what we would consider unbearable living conditions. What's clear is that grand feasts might have happened, but the daily reality for everyone, from the lowliest servant to the highest lord, involved a constant battle against the elements and basic discomforts. Even the lord's private chambers, while slightly better appointed, would still be draughty and cold by modern standards. Furthermore, privacy was almost non-existent. Large halls served multiple functions: dining, sleeping, meeting, even sometimes housing animals. You'd share your sleeping space with many others, often on straw mattresses, listening to the cacophony of snoring, coughing, and distant noises. The grandeur of the stone exterior hid a reality of cramped, unhygienic, and chilly interiors. So, as you gaze upon a magnificent medieval castle, remember that beneath its imposing beauty lay a world of constant damp, lingering odours, and an omnipresent chill that would make you yearn for a modern-day thermostat. If the castle offered a harsh, though protected, existence, another path for those seeking a different kind of life lay within the walls of a monastery. However, monastic life's strictures reveal an existence that was anything but easy, demanding profound self-discipline, relentless routine, and often significant physical hardship, all in the name of spiritual devotion. A mainstream historical fact is that monks and nuns followed a rigid daily schedule known as the Divine Office, or Liturgy of the Hours, which involved multiple prayer services throughout the day and night, often beginning before dawn and ending long after sunset. Imagine waking in the bitter cold of night, often without adequate heating, to attend services in a draughty chapel. Your days would be meticulously planned, filled with communal prayer, manual labor, such as farming, copying manuscripts, or tending to the sick, and periods of silent contemplation. There was little room for personal whims or deviation from the established rules of the order. For you, considering such a life, it would be a complete surrender of individual autonomy. Your clothing would be simple, coarse robes, your diet meager and often vegetarian, and your possessions limited to bare necessities. The emphasis was on spiritual poverty and detachment from worldly comforts. If you were an operative trying to hide in plain sight within a monastery, you'd have to convincingly adopt this austere lifestyle, blending into a community where every hour of your day was accounted for and every action observed. A quirky tidbit: some monastic orders practiced strict vows of silence, communicating only through specific hand gestures or by writing on wax tablets. Imagine trying to get a message across without uttering a single word, relying purely on a complex set of gestures. It puts a new spin on quiet contemplation. Historians still argue whether the rigorous discipline of monastic life truly fostered profound spiritual growth for the majority of its adherents, or if it sometimes led to hidden struggles, boredom, or even mental health challenges for those unsuited to its demands. What's clear is that it required an extraordinary level of commitment. The medieval monastic ideal was about transcending earthly desires, but the earthly realities of cold cells, monotonous food, and ceaseless routine were constant companions. Even the architecture of monasteries reflected this asceticism. Cells were typically small and unheated, offering minimal comfort. Communal spaces, while grand, were designed for solemnity, not coziness. Baths were infrequent, contributing to the general medieval lack of hygiene. So, while you might escape the direct violence of the outside world within monastic walls, you would trade it for a different kind of austerity. A life of continuous self-denial and rigorous adherence to divine law. It reminds you that even the paths seemingly furthest from conflict had their own unique and often overlooked struggles, making the idea of an easy life in the Middle Ages a truly fantastical notion, leaving the contemplative, yet austere, life of the monastery. Let's turn our attention to the bustling, often smelly, world of the medieval town, where craftsmen and merchants carved out a living. Here, you'd encounter guild life's strict rules, a system designed to regulate trades, ensure quality, and, crucially, limit competition. This wasn't a free market, it was a highly structured environment where your profession dictated much of your life. A mainstream historical fact is that guilds controlled virtually every aspect of a particular craft or trade, from setting prices and standards of quality to regulating the training of new members. If you wanted to be a shoemaker, a baker, a carpenter, or even a weaver, you had to join the relevant guild. This meant starting as an apprentice, living with a master craftsman, learning the trade for many years, often 7 to 10 years, with no pay beyond room and board, then becoming a journeyman, working for wages, before finally, if you were skilled and lucky enough, becoming a master yourself and opening your own shop. Imagine dedicating a decade of your life to learning a skill, knowing that your entire future depended on the approval of a select few masters, for you, navigating this world. These rules were ironclad. Trying to practice a trade without guild membership would be nearly impossible, and certainly illegal, leading to fines, confiscation of goods, or even imprisonment. If you were an operative needing a cover identity, becoming a legitimate guild member would be a monumental, time-consuming task. You'd have to convincingly fake years of experience, a network of contacts, and a deep understanding of the craft, a quirky tidbit, to prove their mastery and gain admission to a guild. Journeymen often had to create a masterpiece, a particularly difficult or elaborate piece of work that demonstrated their skill. This is where the term masterpiece actually comes from. So, a baker might have to bake a truly exceptional loaf, or a tailor might have to craft a perfectly fitted garment. Historians still argue whether guilds primarily served to protect consumers by ensuring quality products, or if they were essentially monopolies designed to protect the economic interests of their members and stifle innovation. For those living under their strictures, it was a system that provided both security and profound limitation. You had a guaranteed place in society, a regulated income, and a community of fellow craftsmen, but at the cost of personal economic freedom and the ability to easily change professions or innovate. This rigid structure meant that if you were a skilled artisan, your life was largely set out for you, your social status, your income, even who you married, could be influenced by your guild affiliation. It was a strong community, but also a closed one, making it difficult for outsiders to break in. So, as you walk through a medieval market, admiring the finely crafted goods, remember that each item is not just a product, but the culmination of years of rigorous training, strict rules, and a whole lot of unspoken competition, all governed by the powerful, often unyielding, hand of the guild. Stepping outside the structured confines of the town and its guilds, you face a different set of challenges if your path involved any form of long-distance movement, because in the Middle Ages, trade routes' perils were a very real and constant threat, turning even a simple journey into a perilous adventure fraught with dangers both human and natural. A mainstream historical fact is that travelling any significant distance in the medieval period was incredibly dangerous and slow. Roads were often poorly maintained, if they existed at all, turning into muddy quagmires in wet weather or dusty tracks in dry. There were no maps as we know them, just rough directions and local knowledge, but the biggest threats weren't always the bad roads, they were the people lurking on them. Imagine setting out from your village, perhaps with a small cart of goods to sell at a distant market, knowing that every bend in the road could conceal a band of robbers, or worse, a desperate lord's men looking to tax you heavily, for you, the operative or merchant. This meant constant vigilance. You'd travel in groups if possible, perhaps with armed guards. But even then, safety was never guaranteed. Bandits were a pervasive problem, preying on travellers and merchants who carried valuable goods or coin. Beyond human threats, you faced the whims of nature. Rivers could swell and become impassable, bridges could be washed out, and sudden storms could leave you stranded for days, exposed to the elements. A quirky tidbit, some medieval travellers relied on pilgrim tokens or safe conduct passes from powerful lords or religious institutions, hoping these would offer some protection from bandits or hostile local authorities. It was essentially an early form of diplomatic immunity. though its effectiveness often varied wildly depending on the moral compass of the person you encountered. Historians still argue whether the high risks associated with medieval trade actually spurred innovation in banking and insurance, like letters of credit to avoid carrying large sums of cash, or if they primarily acted as a brake on economic development, limiting trade to essential goods and high-value items. What's clear is that every journey was a gamble. You weren't just transporting goods, you were risking your life. Disease was another silent killer on the roads. Sleeping in crowded, unsanitary inns, or simply being exposed to people from different regions, meant you were constantly susceptible to whatever new illness was circulating. So, as you travel along a winding track, the wind rustling through the trees, you listen not just for the sounds of nature, but for the telltale jingle of horse tack, the murmur of distant voices, or the unexpected glint of steel. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every isolated inn could be a trap. The notion of a swift, uneventful journey was almost unheard of. It reminds you that the freedom of movement we take for granted today, the ability to travel hundreds of miles in a single day with relative safety, is a very modern luxury. In the Middle Ages, every mile was earned, and every journey was an act of courage or desperation. Following those perilous trade routes, or any journey at all, you quickly come to appreciate the astonishingly slow pace of travel in the Middle Ages. Our modern impatience, where an hour-long delay feels like an eternity, would be utterly baffling to someone from this era. In the medieval world, getting anywhere, even what we consider short distances, was an enormous undertaking, consuming vast amounts of time and energy. A mainstream historical fact is that travel by foot was the most common mode of transport for the majority of people, with an average daily walking distance of perhaps 15 to 20 miles, 25-30 kilometers on good terrain. If you were lucky enough to have a horse, you might double that. But horses needed rest, food, and water, and often required specialized care. Carts and wagons, while able to carry more, were even slower, constantly challenged by rough roads and requiring frequent stops for repairs or to navigate obstacles. Imagine trying to get from, say, London to Rome. That's a journey that would take weeks, even months. A significant portion of your year dedicated just to the act of moving from one place to another. For you, the medieval operative or just a simple traveller. This meant that your world was incredibly small. Most people lived and died within a few miles of their birthplace, simply because venturing further was too time-consuming, expensive, and dangerous. A message sent across a kingdom could take days or weeks to arrive. Reinforcements for an army might only show up long after a battle was lost or won. This slow pace of communication and movement profoundly shaped geopolitics, trade, and even the spread of ideas. A quirky tidbit, medieval travel guides, when they existed, were often not maps, but lists of towns and significant landmarks along a route, along with information about inns or monasteries where one could find lodging. So, rather than seeing a line on a map, you'd get a list. First to Merton, then to Chilcombe, mind the river crossing. Historians still argue whether this enforced slowness led to more localized, self-sufficient communities, or if it simply exacerbated existing divides and limited broader cultural exchange. What's clear is that journeys were sagas. You planned for days, even weeks, before setting out. You packed provisions, arranged for lodging in inns, often crowded and flea-ridden, and braced yourself for discomfort and uncertainty. There was no concept of a quick trip or a weekend getaway. Every mile was a deliberate effort. So, as you trudge along a muddy track, the setting sun painting the sky, you realize you've covered perhaps 15 miles in an entire day, and you still have days, perhaps weeks, more to go. Your body aches, your feet are sore, and the prospect of reaching your destination seems dauntingly far off. It truly makes you appreciate the incredible speed and ease of modern transportation, where distances that once took months can now be covered in a matter of hours. The medieval world was a place where time itself seemed to stretch out, making every journey a testament to endurance. In a world defined by its slow pace, harsh conditions, and constant labor, it's perhaps unsurprising that childhood, as we understand it today, was a luxury rarely afforded. Instead, you'd witness child labour's prevalence, with children working from a very young age in dangerous conditions, their innocence quickly stripped away by the demands of survival. A mainstream historical fact is that children were considered miniature adults from as early as 5 or 6 years old, expected to contribute to the household economy. There was no concept of a protected childhood dedicated to play and formal education for the vast majority. If you were born into a peasant family, you'd be put to work as soon as you could manage basic tasks. Imagine a small child, barely taller than a sheep, tending flocks in a field, exposed to the elements, or a slightly older child in a workshop, performing repetitive, often dangerous, tasks like carding wool or carrying heavy buckets. Their hands, though small, were put to work from dawn till dusk. For you, observing this reality, it would be a stark contrast to modern sensibilities. School was a rarity, reserved almost exclusively for boys destined for the clergy or the highest nobility. Playtime, if it existed, was unstructured and opportunistic, squeezed into brief moments between chores. If you were an operative trying to blend into a village, you'd see children everywhere, not in classrooms or playgrounds, but engaged in serious, often back-breaking, work. This early introduction to labour hardened them, but also left them vulnerable to injury, illness, and stunted development. A quirky tidbit in some medieval crafts, like weaving, children were valued for their small, nimble fingers, which could perform intricate tasks that adults found more difficult. So, their size, far from being a disadvantage, sometimes made them ideal labourers for specific jobs. Historians still argue whether this early entry into labour fostered resilience and practical skills, or if it simply exploited children and shortened their already precarious lifespans. What's undeniable is the lack of protection for these young workers. Accidents in workshops were common, injuries from agricultural tools frequent, and exposure to harsh weather was constant. There were no child labour laws, no safety regulations. A child was simply another pair of hands to contribute to the collective survival of the family. So, as you walk through a medieval village, you don't see children playing with toys as much as you see them performing chores, helping adults, or tending to younger siblings. Their faces, often smudged with dirt, would already bear a certain seriousness, a premature understanding of the harsh realities of life. The concept of childhood as a distinct, carefree period of development is a relatively modern invention. In the Middle Ages, survival was paramount, and everyone, regardless of age, was expected to pull their weight. It paints a rather grim picture of youth, making you appreciate the protected, playful, and educational opportunities afforded to children today, beyond the strenuous labour of both adults and children. Another daily battle that consumed medieval life was the constant struggle against spoilage. You see, the modern convenience of refrigeration was millennia away, which meant that food preservation challenges were enormous, defining what people ate, when they ate it, and how much of it was wasted. A mainstream historical fact is that most food had to be consumed quickly after harvesting or slaughter, or preserved through methods like salting, smoking, drying, or pickling. Imagine the intensity of harvest season, when vast quantities of grain, fruits, and vegetables needed to be processed and stored before they rotted. Meat, once an animal was slaughtered, would begin to spoil almost immediately in warmer weather. There was no chilling, no freezing, no vacuum sealing. Your entire year's survival depended on the effectiveness of these labour-intensive preservation techniques. For you, the medieval individual, the spectre of food spoilage was always present. A particularly humid season could ruin dried grains. A lack of salt could mean an entire slaughtered pig went to waste. If you were an operative on the move, carrying rations was a tricky business. Hardtack, a type of hard, dry biscuit, dried meat, and aged cheese were your only reliable options for travel, and even these could become unpalatable or unsafe over time. Imagine relying on a piece of dried, heavily salted fish for sustenance, knowing that its taste was less than appealing, but its preservation was paramount. A quirky tidbit, honey was a highly valued commodity not just for sweetness, but also as a preservative. sometimes used to preserve meat due to its antimicrobial properties. So, if you were lucky enough to be an assassin targeting royalty, you might find yourself surprisingly well fed, or at least, well preserved. Historians still argue whether the limited food preservation techniques of the Middle Ages were a primary factor in the prevalence of malnutrition and foodborne illnesses, or if medieval people simply adapted their diets to seasonal availability and the immediate consumption of fresh produce. What's clear is the sheer effort involved. Every household, from the humblest peasant cottage to the grandest castle kitchen, was a hub of constant preservation activity. Smoking houses, salt barrels, and drying racks were essential features of life. This constant battle against decay also influenced social practices. Feasts, when fresh meat was available, were often massive affairs designed to consume large quantities of food before it could spoil. The concept of leftovers to be neatly packed away for another day was largely foreign. Any excess was often shared, or simply allowed to rot, contributing to the general unsanitary conditions we've already discussed. So, as you look at your plate of rather unappetizing, heavily salted or smoked fare, remember that its blandness is a direct result of the ingenious, yet rudimentary, methods employed to simply keep you from starving. It certainly makes you appreciate your modern refrigerator and its magical ability to keep things fresh for weeks on end. Beyond the challenges of food and the slow pace of life, one aspect of the medieval world that would consistently assault your senses, and indeed your very being, was the pervasive lack of basic hygiene. Forget daily showers, deodorant, or even regular hand washing. In this era, cleanliness as we understand it simply wasn't a priority, or even a possibility. For most people, the result, everyone smelled a bit ripe, most of the time. A mainstream historical fact is that bathing was infrequent for the vast majority of the population, often limited to a few times a year, if at all. Water was difficult to heat and transport, and soap was a luxury or simply not available in the forms we recognize. Imagine going weeks, or even months, without a proper wash. Your skin would be grimy, your hair greasy and tangled, and your clothes, as we've discussed, would carry the accumulated odors of sweat, smoke, and unidentifiable effluvia. The concept of fresh laundry was a rare delight, often involving communal washing in a river or stream, and then line drying, perhaps with some rudimentary lye-based soap. For you, navigating this world, your sense of smell would be constantly challenged. You'd encounter a pungent mixture of unwashed bodies, animal waste, rotting food, wood smoke, and sweat everywhere you went. The air indoors, especially in crowded inns or homes, would be heavy and stagnant if you were an operative trying to blend in. Paradoxically, being too clean might make you stand out. Some medieval medical texts actually advised against frequent bathing, believing it opened up the pores and made the body more susceptible to disease. So, in their minds, being less clean was actually a form of protection. It sounds utterly counterintuitive to us, but it was their logic. Historians still argue whether medieval people simply had a much higher tolerance for body odor, or if they tried to mask it with strong perfumes and herbs when possible. What's undeniable is that personal space, as a concept related to hygiene, was very different. People lived in much closer quarters, and the pervasive smells were simply a part of life. There was no escaping it. Even the wealthy, who might have access to rudimentary baths or scented waters, still lived in a world where everyone else was largely unwashed. So, as you go about your day, you realize that your own body, despite your best efforts, would always carry the distinct scent of the Middle Ages. Your skin would feel clammy, your hair matted, and the idea of a refreshing, hot shower would be a concept beyond your wildest dreams. It makes you truly appreciate the simple act of turning on a tap and having clean, warm water readily available. The medieval world was a testament to human resilience in the face of persistent grime, proving that sometimes ignorance truly can be bliss, or at least a necessity for survival. Beyond the human inhabitants and their peculiar hygiene habits, your journey through the medieval world would be constantly intertwined with animal encounters. You'd be dealing with pests, livestock, and wild animals in remarkably close quarters, not just as a part of the landscape, but as an integral, often challenging, part of daily life. A mainstream historical fact is that animals were everywhere in medieval towns and villages, not confined to farms or pet homes as they largely are today. Pigs, chickens, dogs, and cats roamed freely, often rooting through refuse in the streets, contributing to the general unsanitary conditions. Horses and oxen were essential for transport and labour, but their presence also meant manure and noise. Imagine walking through a busy market square, dodging not just people but chickens scurrying underfoot, a grunting pig, and piles of fresh horse dung. It was a cacophony of animal sounds and smells that was simply part of the urban symphony. For you, the medieval individual, whether a peasant or an operative, these encounters were constant. Rats and mice were an ever-present menace in homes and food storage areas, not just a nuisance, but carriers of disease. As history would tragically prove, fleas and lice, often carried by animals, and humans. Some medieval households kept ferrets to hunt rats and mice, as they were surprisingly effective pest controllers. So, you might stumble upon a small, agile ferret disappearing into a wall cavity, doing its part for medieval pest management. Historians still argue whether the close proximity of humans and animals contributed significantly to the spread of zoonotic diseases, those transmitted from animals to humans, during major pandemics, or if other factors were more dominant. What's clear is the intimate relationship. Animals provided food, labor, clothing, and companionship, but they also brought dirt, disease, and sometimes danger. A wild boar or a pack of wolves could threaten your livestock or even your life if you ventured into the surrounding forests. So, as you step over a pile of animal droppings and swat at a persistent fly, you realize that the medieval world was far from exclusively human. It was a living, breathing ecosystem where the boundaries between human and animal life were much more permeable. Your interactions with animals were not just occasional, they were constant, varied, and often defined by necessity or, unfortunately, by the transmission of unwelcome passengers like fleas. It makes you realize how much we've sanitized our modern environment, pushing animals to the periphery of our daily lives, a stark contrast to the immersive, wild, and sometimes smelly animal kingdom of the Middle Ages. Beyond the tangible challenges of animals, disease, and daily grime, a far more pervasive force shaped every fibre of medieval life: religious authority's power. The church was not just an institution, it was the ultimate arbiter of truth, morality, and often, even law. Its doctrines permeated every aspect of existence, from birth to death, influencing your thoughts, actions, and prospects for the afterlife. A mainstream historical fact is that the Catholic Church held immense political, economic, and spiritual power across medieval Europe, often surpassing that of kings and emperors. It owned vast tracts of land, commanded immense wealth through tithes and donations, and maintained its own legal system, canon law. Imagine a world where the local priest was not just a spiritual guide, but also a central figure in your community, often the most educated person, and someone whose pronouncements carried undeniable weight. Disobeying the church wasn't just a sin, it could lead to excommunication, a terrifying prospect that meant social ostracization and, terrifyingly, the belief that your soul was condemned to eternal damnation. For you, the medieval individual, adherence to church doctrine was non-negotiable. You attended Mass regularly, confessed your sins, and participated in religious rituals. Your understanding of the world, from cosmology to morality, was framed by church teachings. If you were an operative, your mission might even be sanctioned by a religious authority. Or, conversely, you might be targeting someone deemed a heretic, making your work a righteous act in the eyes of some. Or, if your target was a powerful church figure, you would be acutely aware of the spiritual and temporal risks involved. A quirky tidbit: during the medieval period, the church often mandated specific feast and fast days, which dramatically altered people's diets, e.g., no meat on Fridays, or during Lent. This wasn't just a religious observance, it had significant economic and social implications, dictating what could be sold and consumed. It was, in effect, a divinely mandated dietary restriction. Historians still argue whether the church's immense power was primarily a unifying force, providing social cohesion and moral guidance in a turbulent era, or if it sometimes stifled intellectual inquiry and maintained social hierarchies through divine justification. What's clear is its omnipresence. From the grand cathedrals towering over cities to the humble village chapel, the physical presence of the church was undeniable. Its bells marked the hours of the day. Its saints provided comfort and intercession, and its pronouncements shaped public opinion. So, as you go about your daily life, every decision, every thought, would be filtered through the lens of religious belief. The fear of God's wrath, the hope of salvation, and the ever-present influence of the clergy would be a constant part of your internal landscape. It's a profound difference from our increasingly secular world, reminding you just how deeply intertwined faith and power were in the Middle Ages, making the act of rebellion against either a truly audacious and dangerous undertaking under the pervasive sway of religious authority. Your medieval life was further constrained by limited personal freedom. The concept of individual autonomy, of charting your own course based on personal ambition or desire, was largely foreign. Instead, your life path was often dictated by birth and circumstance, with very little room for deviation. A mainstream historical fact is that your social status was largely determined at birth, meaning if you were born a peasant, you would almost certainly die a peasant. If you were born a serf, you were tied to the land. Opportunities for social mobility were incredibly rare, typically limited to joining the church, becoming a successful merchant, a difficult and dangerous path, or through exceptional military prowess, though even then, true elevation to the nobility was a rarity. Imagine knowing, from the moment you drew your first breath, that your future was essentially predetermined, that the dreams you might harbour were largely unattainable. For you, the medieval individual, this meant a profound lack of choice. Your occupation was often inherited, your marriage might be arranged for economic or social reasons, and your movements were restricted by feudal obligations or the dangers of travel. If you were an operative, you were either compelled into this life, or you were an extraordinary outlier, an individual who managed to break free from the societal norms to pursue a dangerous, independent path. Even then, your freedom was relative, often dictated by the powerful figures who employed you. A quirky tidbit, to prevent peasants from leaving their lord's land. Some medieval lords imposed a flight tax or chevage, a payment required for a serf to leave the manor, which effectively bound them even if they weren't legally slaves. It was a financial disincentive designed to keep labour tied to the land. Historians still argue whether this lack of personal freedom led to greater social stability and collective well-being, as everyone knew their place, or if it suppressed individual creativity and contributed to widespread resentment and periodic revolts. What's clear is that the medieval concept of rights was far different from our modern understanding. It was often about duties and obligations within a hierarchical system, rather than inherent individual liberties. You didn't have the right to pursue happiness or choose your career. You had the duty to serve your lord, your family, and God. So, as you go about your daily tasks, whether toiling in the fields or performing a dangerous mission, the weight of these invisible chains would be ever present. Your aspirations were modest, your horizons limited. The notion of picking up and moving to a new city for a fresh start, or choosing a completely different profession, was almost unimaginable for most. It truly puts into perspective the immense personal freedoms we enjoy today, freedoms that would have seemed like impossible dreams to someone living in the constrained reality of the Middle Ages, following the restrictions on personal freedom. Another stark limitation of medieval life was the profound education's exclusivity. The pathway to knowledge, literacy, and intellectual development was a narrow one, primarily reserved for specific social strata, leaving the vast majority of the population in a state of intellectual darkness. A mainstream historical fact is that formal education, beyond basic religious instruction, was overwhelmingly the domain of the church and the wealthiest nobility. Monasteries and cathedrals housed schools where future clergy were trained, learning Latin, theology, and philosophy. A very small number of elite children, usually boys, might receive tutoring in basic literacy and arithmetic. For the overwhelming majority of people, your education was practical, learning a craft from your parents or a master, or acquiring the skills necessary for farming. Imagine growing up in a world where the ability to read a book, or even recognize the letters on a document, was as rare and specialized as, say, being an astronaut today for you, the medieval individual. This meant that access to knowledge was severely restricted, even for those with wealth. There were no public libraries, no widely available printed books, as the printing press wouldn't arrive until much later in the period. Knowledge was passed down orally through apprenticeships or confined to precious, hand-copied manuscripts locked away in monastic libraries. If you were an operative needing to gather information, you couldn't just look it up. You'd rely on spies, rumors, or the slow, unreliable transmission of word-of-mouth intelligence. A quirky tidbit to ensure the accuracy of precious manuscripts. Medieval scribes sometimes included elaborate colophons at the end of their work, often whimsical or exasperated pleas for the reader to correct any errors, or even curses upon those who might steal or deface the book. Imagine painstakingly copying a text for months, then adding a little note like, "If you find a mistake, blame the devil." Historians still argue whether the lack of widespread education contributed to the slower pace of scientific and technological advancement in the Middle Ages, or if other societal structures were more significant factors. What's clear is the profound impact on individual lives. Without broad access to literacy and critical thinking skills, people were more susceptible to superstition, misinformation, and the unquestioned authority of religious and political leaders. Your worldview was limited by what you personally experienced, heard, or were taught by those in power. So, as you listen to a sermon, or hear a proclamation from the town crier, you recognize that your understanding of complex ideas or distant events is entirely mediated by others. You can't cross-reference. You can't verify, you simply absorb. This inherent limitation in access to information and analytical tools made the medieval mind fundamentally different from our own. It truly makes you appreciate the democratic access to information that modern education and technology provide, a concept that would have been utterly alien and perhaps even dangerous to the ruling elite of the Middle Ages, with limited personal freedom and restricted access to education. It's perhaps unsurprising that the medieval concept of justice was equally, if not more, arbitrary than ours today. You'd face justice's arbitrary nature, where legal outcomes were often based not on clear evidence or fair process, but on superstition, brute force, or the whims of local authority. A mainstream historical fact is that trials by ordeal were common throughout much of the early and high Middle Ages. Imagine being accused of a crime, perhaps theft or murder, with little to no concrete evidence against you. Instead of a jury and reasoned arguments, you might be subjected to an ordeal of hot iron, where you'd carry a red-hot iron for a certain distance, and if your hand healed cleanly after 3 days, you were deemed innocent by divine intervention. Or the ordeal of water, where you'd be thrown into a body of water, and if you floated, you were guilty because pure water would reject you. But if you sank, you were innocent, though likely drowned. These were not tests of guilt, they were tests of divine favor, utterly beyond human control. For you, the accused, such a trial would be terrifying. Your fate hinged entirely on luck, the executioner's bias, or perhaps your ability to withstand unimaginable pain and somehow emerge unscathed. There was no presumption of innocence. If you were an operative caught attempting a covert act, you wouldn't expect a fair hearing. You'd expect a swift, brutal interrogation, followed by an ordeal or immediate punishment. A quirky tidbit, another form of medieval justice was trial by combat, where the accused and accuser or their champions would fight, with the victor deemed to be in the right, supposedly reflecting God's judgment. It effectively turned legal disputes into gladiatorial contests, which certainly adds a unique twist to jurisprudence. Historians still argue whether these trials by ordeal and combat were truly believed to be manifestations of divine will, or if they were pragmatic, though brutal, ways to resolve disputes in societies without strong centralized legal systems and investigative methods. What's clear is the profound lack of due process as we understand it. Justice was often swift, public, and inherently unfair by modern standards. Confessions, as we discussed, were often extracted through torture, rendering any subsequent trial a mere formality. So, as you witness a public shaming, or hear of someone undergoing an ordeal, you grasp the precariousness of life under such a system. A simple accusation, a disgruntled neighbour, or a lord's ill favour could swiftly lead you down a path with no logical escape. It truly makes you appreciate the elaborate and often frustrating legal systems we have today, designed, however imperfectly, to protect the rights of the accused and base judgments on evidence, not on whether a hot iron burns you or if you sink in a pond. The medieval world was a place where fate, and sometimes extreme pain, were the ultimate arbiters of truth. If the justice system itself was arbitrary, then the daily reality of crime and punishment was a stark, often brutal, reflection of medieval society's fear and desire for public order. Petty offences could carry disproportionately harsh penalties, demonstrating the severe measures taken to control a population with few formal policing mechanisms. A mainstream historical fact is that punishments for even minor crimes were often public and physically painful, designed not just to punish the individual but to deter others through fear. Imagine stealing a loaf of bread to feed your starving family. Your punishment might involve being placed in the stocks or the pillory in the town square, exposed to public ridicule, humiliation, and even assault from passers-by who might pelt you with rotten food or stones. For slightly more serious offences, a hand might be amputated, or an ear cut off. There was no 3 strikes and you're out policy. Justice was swift and often disfiguring for you. The medieval operative, or commoner, this pervasive system of harsh penalties meant that every small infraction carried immense risk. You couldn't afford to make mistakes, even minor ones, because the consequences were so severe and visible. If you needed to steal a horse for a mission, you'd know that failure meant not just capture, but potentially losing a limb. The threat of public shaming was almost as powerful as physical pain, as honour and reputation were highly valued in tight-knit communities. A quirky tidbit: some medieval towns had specific, bizarre punishments for minor offences, like the ducking stool for gossiping women, where they would be repeatedly submerged in water. It seems like a rather damp way to enforce social norms, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether the brutality of medieval punishments was a direct result of a lack of prisons, which were rare and mainly for holding people before trial, or if it reflected a deeply ingrained belief in retributive justice, where the punishment directly mirrored the perceived severity of the offence. What's clear is the stark difference from modern correctional philosophies that often emphasize rehabilitation. In the Middle Ages, it was about immediate, visible retribution and deterrence. So, as you walk through a town square, perhaps passing the gallows or seeing someone in the stocks, you internalize the very real dangers of stepping out of line. The fear of punishment was a constant, tangible presence, shaping behavior and reinforcing social hierarchies. There were no hidden cells or secret courtrooms. The consequences of crime were broadcast for all to see, serving as a chilling reminder of the ever-present power of the Lord or the state. It makes you realize how much our modern society relies on subtler forms of social control, as opposed to the blunt, public spectacles of pain and humiliation that defined justice in the medieval world. Amidst the strictures of legal systems and the dangers of daily life, your medieval existence was further confined by the rigid framework of gender roles. Rigidity, your destiny, opportunities, and even your daily tasks were largely predetermined by whether you were born male or female, with very limited exceptions. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval society was overwhelmingly patriarchal, with men holding virtually all positions of power, authority, and public influence. Women, regardless of social class, were generally expected to manage the household, bear and raise children, and support their husbands. For peasant women, this meant an endless cycle of agricultural labour alongside men, but also cooking, cleaning, spinning, weaving, and caring for the family. Imagine your life being almost entirely confined to the domestic sphere, or to specific, often unseen, forms of labour, with your voice rarely heard in public affairs. For you, navigating this world, your gender would immediately define your opportunities and limitations. If you were a man, your path might lead to farming, a craft, soldiering, or the church. If you were a woman, Your primary role was wife and mother, with economic activity often limited to tasks that could be done within or very close to the home. Even if you were an operative, your gender would dictate your approach. A male assassin might blend in as a traveling merchant or soldier. A female operative might have to rely on less direct methods, perhaps leveraging social connections or domestic roles, as direct physical confrontation was rarely an option. A quirky tidbit: while most women were excluded from formal education, some aristocratic women were highly educated in convents or at home, becoming notable patrons of the arts and even influential political figures behind the scenes. So, while rare, some women found ways to exert influence outside the most overt male-dominated structures. Historians still argue whether medieval women, despite their restricted public roles, exercised significant informal power within the household and community, or if their lives were largely dictated by male authority with little recourse. What's clear is the profound social conditioning. From childhood, boys and girls were taught their distinct roles and responsibilities. Girls learned domestic skills and subservience, while boys learned trades and the importance of physical strength and authority. So, as you observe the daily interactions in a medieval village or town, you see a clear division of labor and social expectation based on sex. Men gather in taverns, discuss business, and participate in public life, while women are often seen at the well, tending to gardens, or engaged in textile production. The idea of equality, or even significant individual choice in one's life path, was largely absent. It truly highlights how deeply ingrained and profoundly influential gender norms were, making your very identity and potential a product of your sex in ways that are largely unimaginable in many modern societies. Within the strictures of medieval society, where gender roles were rigid and personal freedoms limited, another defining characteristic of life was the pervasive reality of the community's close watch. You lived in a world where privacy, as we understand it, was virtually non-existent, and everyone knew your business, for better or worse. A mainstream historical fact is that most people lived in small, tightly knit communities, whether a village or a specific neighborhood within a town, where social networks were incredibly strong and interdependent. There were no anonymous crowds. Everyone knew everyone else, their family history, their habits, and their reputation. Your home might be a single room, shared with your entire family, and perhaps even some livestock in winter. Walls were thin, and doors often left ajar. Imagine trying to keep a secret in such an environment. Your neighbors would be acutely aware of who came and went, what you were doing, and whether you were adhering to local customs and expectations. For you, the medieval individual, this constant surveillance was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it provided a strong sense of belonging, mutual support in times of hardship, and collective security against outside threats. On the other hand, it meant immense social pressure to conform, deviate from the norm, and you'd quickly become the subject of gossip, suspicion, or even ostracization. If you were an operative trying to move discreetly, this was a monumental challenge. Every new face was instantly noted, every unusual action meticulously observed. Trying to be unseen in such a world was almost impossible, as people were inherently suspicious of strangers and anything out of the ordinary. A quirky tidbit: in some medieval villages, there was a tithing man, or frank pledge system, where groups of 10 households were collectively responsible for the good behavior of their members. If one person committed a crime, the entire group could be held accountable, further reinforcing communal watchfulness. It was an early form of collective policing, driven by necessity. Historians still argue whether this intense communal scrutiny fostered stronger social bonds and reduced crime, or if it led to stifling conformity and limited individual expression. What's clear is that your reputation was everything. A good name could open doors, a bad one could lead to social ruin and economic hardship. There was no escaping your past or forging a completely new identity without leaving your community entirely, which, as we discussed, was incredibly difficult and dangerous. So, as you walk through your village, you feel the unspoken eyes upon you, the subtle judgments, the knowing glances. You're part of a living tapestry, intricately woven into the lives of everyone around you. The idea of privacy, of a personal sphere untouched by community observation, was a concept yet to be invented. It really makes you appreciate the relative anonymity of modern life, where you can move through a city of millions without a soul knowing your name or your business. In the Middle Ages, your identity was inextricably linked to your place within the watchful eye of your community, adding to the constant communal scrutiny and the general lack of hygiene. Your medieval senses would be constantly bombarded by the intense reality of noise and odor pollution. This wasn't just an occasional nuisance, it was the ever-present backdrop to daily life, a cacophony of sounds and a miasma of smells that would overwhelm any modern person. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval towns and cities were incredibly noisy places, lacking any form of sound dampening. Imagine walking through a street filled with the clatter of horse hooves on unpaved roads, the creak of wooden cartwheels, the shouts of merchants hawking their wares, the cries of street vendors, the incessant barking of dogs, and the distant clang of blacksmiths and carpenters. Every noise echoed in the narrow, winding alleys, amplified by the close-packed wooden and stone buildings. There were no quiet residential zones. Homes and workshops were often intertwined, meaning you'd hear the sounds of your neighbors' lives, their arguments, their industry, and their animals, all day and often through the night. For you, the medieval individual, this constant auditory assault would be relentless. Sleep might be interrupted by passing watchmen calling out the hour, or the distant bleating of sheep. Your ears would be constantly processing a complex tapestry of sounds, many of which would be grating or jarring to modern ears if you were an operative needing to move stealthily. The ambient noise could be both a blessing and a curse. It might mask your own movements, but also make it impossible to hear an approaching guard or a whispered conversation, a quirky tidbit to announce their presence and services. Medieval tradesmen and street vendors often developed distinctive, loud cries or songs, which became a ubiquitous part of the urban soundscape. So, your ears would be constantly assaulted by jingles and shouts, making it hard to think straight. Historians still argue whether medieval people simply had a higher tolerance for noise, or if the constant clamour had a detrimental effect on their hearing and stress levels, though without any scientific understanding of such things at the time. What's equally impactful is the odour pollution. We've already touched on the sewage in the streets and the infrequent bathing. Add to that the pervasive smell of wood smoke from countless hearths, the stench from butchers' shops where animal parts might be discarded in the open, tanneries with their vats of putrid chemicals, and the general aroma of unwashed bodies and stale food. The air was a heavy, multi-layered perfume of decomposition and human activity, so, as you breathe in the thick, pungent air and try to make sense of the overwhelming din, you realize that your senses would be in a constant state of alert, or perhaps simply overwhelmed and dulled. The medieval world was not a place for the faint of nose or ear. It truly makes you appreciate the relative quiet and fresh air in many places of modern environments, reminding you that sometimes the most mundane aspects of our lives are, in fact, incredibly luxurious in comparison to the sensory onslaught of the past, given the sensory overload of noise and odour, and the sheer effort involved in daily survival. It's probably no surprise that your opportunities for leisure and amusement were incredibly limited. In the Middle Ages, there was a severe lack of entertainment as we know it, with amusements being simple, often communal, and usually tied to religious festivals or rare public events. A mainstream historical fact is that most medieval entertainment revolved around public spectacles, religious holidays, or simple communal activities. You wouldn't find theatres showing plays every night, or concert halls, or even widespread individual pastimes like reading for pleasure. Instead, you might attend a church feast day, which often involved singing, dancing, storytelling, and perhaps some simple games. Travelling minstrels or jesters might occasionally visit a town or a lord's court, offering songs, juggling, or basic comedic performances. Imagine the excitement that would ripple through a village when a group of travelling performers arrived. A rare break in the monotonous rhythm of daily labour, for you, the medieval individual. Your leisure time would be scarce and highly valued. After a long day of work, you might gather with neighbours to tell stories, play simple board games like chess or dice, or listen to local gossip. There were no designated entertainment districts or mass-produced diversions. If you were an operative needing a distraction, or trying to gather information in a relaxed setting, a tavern might be your best bet, though even then, conversations would be local and often wary of strangers. A quirky tidbit, bear baiting and cockfighting were surprisingly popular forms of entertainment, often drawing large crowds. Imagine watching a chained bear fight a pack of dogs, or two roosters clawing at each other. It speaks to a very different threshold for amusement and a more visceral connection to animal cruelty than most modern societies would tolerate. Historians still argue whether the limited forms of entertainment led to a more robust oral tradition and stronger community bonds, or if it contributed to the overall harshness and perceived lack of joy in medieval life. What's clear is that the pursuit of leisure was not an inherent right or even a common expectation. It was a privilege, often earned through hard work, or a communal event sanctioned by the church or local lord. The idea of going out for fun in the modern sense simply didn't exist, so, as you attend a local fair, watching a clumsy puppet show or listening to a ballad sung by a travelling minstrel, you realise how simple and unrefined your entertainment options are. There are no dazzling special effects, no complex narratives, just straightforward performances for a weary, easily amused audience. It truly makes you appreciate the incredible array of entertainment choices we have at our fingertips today, from streaming movies to elaborate video games, all of which would have been unimaginable technological miracles to someone living in the sparse and often brutal entertainment landscape of the Middle Ages. Beyond the daily grind and limited entertainment, one ever-present and truly terrifying threat hung over every medieval settlement: fire's constant threat. Wooden towns, packed tightly together, with open hearths and rudimentary lighting, were tinderboxes waiting for a spark, and a conflagration could wipe out an entire community in a matter of hours. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval buildings were overwhelmingly constructed from highly flammable materials like wood, thatch, and straw, often crammed together along narrow, winding streets. Fire was an omnipresent danger. Imagine living in a timber-framed house, with a cooking fire burning constantly in an open hearth, and lighting provided by flickering candles or rushlights. One misplaced ember, a careless dropped lamp, or even a strong gust of wind carrying sparks from a chimney could quickly ignite your home, and then your neighbours, in a horrifying chain reaction. For you, the medieval resident, the fear of fire was profound and personal. There were no organised fire departments, no hydrants, no modern firefighting equipment beyond buckets of water and perhaps a few long hooks to pull down burning structures, hopefully creating fire breaks. If a fire started, the entire community would rush to fight it. But often their efforts were futile against the sheer speed and intensity of the blaze. If you were an operative needing to move through a town, a fire could be both a chaotic distraction and an immense risk, forcing you to flee or trapping you in a deadly inferno. A quirky tidbit: some medieval cities had strict rules about putting out all fires at night, enforced by watchmen. This is where the term curfew, from the Old French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire, actually originates. It was a desperate attempt to prevent nighttime conflagrations. Historians still argue whether the frequent large-scale fires in medieval towns were primarily due to poor construction techniques, a lack of fire awareness, or simply the unavoidable consequence of living in a pre-industrial era without modern safety measures. What's clear is the devastating impact. A fire could not only destroy your home and all your possessions, but also your livelihood. As shops and workshops were consumed, entire communities could be rendered homeless in a single night, forced to rebuild from scratch with limited resources. So, as you see the glow of hearths in windows at night, or smell the faint scent of wood smoke in the air, you are constantly aware of the fragility of your built environment. Your home, your sanctuary, was always just one errant spark away from becoming a pile of ashes. It makes you truly appreciate the fire safety regulations, non-flammable building materials, and rapid response of modern fire services that protect our homes and lives today. In the Middle Ages, fire was a truly wild and untamed force, a constant reminder of humanity's vulnerability in the face of nature's destructive power. Beyond the immediate threats of fire and famine, The medieval world was also deeply unstable due to political instability. Power was often contested, allegiances shifted like desert sands, and the line between legitimate rule and brute force was often incredibly blurry. You lived in a time where the very foundations of your society could be shaken at any moment by the ambitions of powerful individuals. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval Europe was characterized by a fragmented political landscape, with numerous kingdoms, duchies, and lordships constantly vying for power, land, and influence. This often led to wars, rebellions, and assassinations, creating an atmosphere of constant uncertainty. Imagine a powerful lord challenging his king, or a rival claimant to a throne sparking a civil war. These conflicts weren't fought on distant battlefields, they directly impacted your life, leading to requisitions of food, forced military service, or the destructive passage of armies through your lands. For you, the medieval commoner or operative, this meant that your loyalties might be tested, and your safety could depend entirely on who held power in your region at any given moment. A change of ruler could mean new taxes, new laws, or even a complete upheaval of your way of life. If you were an assassin, you were often a tool in these very power struggles, a lethal instrument for eliminating rivals or consolidating control. Your success, or failure, could alter the course of a dynasty or even a kingdom. A quirky tidbit, the practice of bastard feudalism emerged in the later Middle Ages, where lords paid retainers with money or grants of land rather than service in exchange for loyalty, blurring the lines of traditional feudal obligations and sometimes leading to even more fluid and unpredictable alliances. It added another layer of complexity to an already tangled web of loyalties and ambitions. Historians still argue whether this constant political turmoil ultimately hindered long-term development, or if it ironically forced innovation in governance and military tactics as rulers sought to secure their positions. What's clear is the profound sense of precariousness it instilled in the population. You couldn't assume that the current peace, however fragile, would last. Rumors of war, of plots, or of powerful figures raising armies would constantly circulate, creating an undercurrent of anxiety. So, as you hear whispers of new alliances or old feuds resurfacing, you understand that your fate, however humble, is inextricably linked to the grand, often violent, game of power played by the elite. The tranquility of your village could be shattered overnight by a lord's ambition or a monarch's decree. It truly makes you appreciate the relative stability of modern nation-states, where, for all their internal disagreements, the fundamental structure of government is rarely overthrown by a sudden, violent power grab. In the Middle Ages, political upheaval was not an abstract concept, it was a tangible threat, constantly lurking just beneath the surface of daily life. Beyond the known threats of political instability and human strife lay the vast, untamed wilderness. This meant constantly facing the dangers lurking beyond the castle walls. The medieval landscape was far from manicured. It was a wild, unpredictable realm teeming with threats that could easily claim the unwary traveler. A mainstream historical fact is that large predators like wolves, bears, and wild boars were far more common across Europe than they are today, often posing a significant threat to livestock and even humans, particularly in sparsely populated areas. Imagine venturing out from the relative safety of your village or town into a dense forest, knowing that a hungry wolf pack or a territorial wild boar could be lurking just out of sight. These weren't just creatures of folklore, they were very real and very dangerous animals that could easily overpower an unarmored person. For you, the medieval individual, whether a woodcutter, a hunter, or an operative needing to travel through the countryside, this meant constant vigilance. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every snapped twig, would send a shiver down your spine. The forests, while providing resources like timber and game, were also places of profound danger and mystery. Bandits, as we've discussed, also favoured these remote areas, making them even more treacherous. A quirky tidbit, to combat the threat of wolves, some medieval communities organised communal wolf hunts, often involving the entire village, not just for sport, but as a desperate measure of protection for their precious livestock. It was a serious, often brutal, business. Historians still argue whether the widespread fear of wilderness and its creatures significantly limited medieval expansion and settlement, or if it simply encouraged people to live in more concentrated, defensible communities. What's clear is the profound psychological impact, the unknown, the untamed, lay just outside the cultivated fields and settled areas. Children were warned not to stray too far, and even seasoned travellers would stick to well-worn paths, often travelling in groups. So, as you step out of the comforting shadow of a village wall and into the looming presence of the ancient woods, you feel a primal sense of vulnerability. The sounds of the forest, the hoot of an owl, the snap of a branch, the distant howl take on a far more menacing quality. There are no national parks with designated hiking trails and helpful signposts. This is nature in its rawest, most unforgiving form. Where every venture beyond the familiar could lead to a fatal encounter, it makes you truly appreciate the relatively tamed and predictable natural world that most of us inhabit today. A stark contrast to the truly wild and often deadly landscapes of the medieval past. And so, after navigating the perils of disease, the discomforts of daily life, the arbitrary nature of justice, the rigid societal structures, and the very real dangers of the untamed world, we arrive at the final, grim chapter of our journey, the assassin's final reckoning. This isn't the glorious, heroic end of a movie, it's the stark, often lonely, and unceremonious conclusion to a life lived on the razor's edge. A mainstream historical fact is that assassination in the Middle Ages was a messy, high-risk affair, often carried out by desperate individuals or small groups, with success far from guaranteed and survival even less so. Forget poison in a goblet or a silent blade in the night for every target. More often, it involved crude ambush, a struggle, or perhaps exploiting a moment of chaos. If you were a medieval assassin, your career was likely brief. You faced capture, torture, and public execution if you failed. And even if you succeeded, you lived with the constant threat of vengeance from your target's family or allies, or betrayal from your own patrons. Imagine completing a dangerous task, only to realize that the reward might be simply living to fight another day, knowing that your life is now permanently forfeit if you're ever caught or identified. For you, the operative, the end could come in countless ways. A slip on a muddy street, a telltale cough exposing your hiding place, a watchful guard more alert than expected, or simply an unexpected turn of events. There were no extraction teams, no safe houses with modern amenities, no witness protection programs. Your success meant disappearing, blending back into the anonymous masses. But even that was a precarious piece. The weight of your actions, the constant fear of discovery, would haunt your every step. A quirky tidbit: some medieval assassinations were actually public acts of political violence that, while certainly lethal, lacked any pretense of stealth, such as the murder of powerful figures in broad daylight by an angry mob or rival faction. So, the assassin wasn't always a shadowy figure. Sometimes, they were a part of a much larger, more overt act of brutality. Historians still argue whether the psychological toll of living such a dangerous and morally ambiguous life eventually broke even the most hardened individuals, or if the desperate circumstances that led them to that path simply made them indifferent to their fate. What's clear is that the medieval assassin's life was not glamorous. It was a brutal existence. Short on comfort and long on peril, your legacy, if any, would likely be one of infamy or anonymity, never glory. As your final breath rattles in your chest, perhaps from a wound, perhaps from disease, perhaps from the headsman's axe, you realize the true cost of such a life. The silence that follows is not a cinematic crescendo, but simply the quiet cessation of struggle, blending into the ambient noises of the medieval world you fought so hard to survive. There's no fade to black, no triumphant score. Just the quiet passing of another soul in an era where life itself was a constant battle, and death, the ultimate, unavoidable reckoning, the weight of the scratchy tunic, the lingering scent of smoke and grime, the ghost of a persistent toothache. These are the indelible marks of a life lived and lost in the merciless heart of the Middle Ages. The wind rustles softly through the eaves, a gentle whisper against the stone walls of your mind. The distant clatter of hooves fades, replaced by the soft hum of the night. Settling over fields and forgotten pathways, imagine the faint, sweet scent of night-blooming jasmine, carried on a breeze that soothes tired bones. Let the images drift away, like wisps of smoke from a dying fire, dissolving into the quiet dark. There's no urgency here, no need to hold on to the cold stone or the muddy track, just the gentle rhythm of your own breath, slowing, deepening. The world outside, with its ancient struggles and forgotten fears, recedes further and further, becoming a soft, indistinct murmur in the vast quiet. Allow yourself to sink deeper into the comfort of your space, wrapped in the warmth of blankets. The echoes of history are now just distant dreams, fading softly into the calm. Let your thoughts soften, unburdened, as peace enfolds you. End of script. Sweet dreams.